Hello, dear listening squirrels. Now I need more batteries and more freshly recharged batteries, so we're not going to worry with it. Okay, we're on part 2 of this chapter. Whatever chapter it is. You'll see it because it'll be entitled, but it's not right now. For me, Mrs. Blenkinsop was reading a letter on thin foreign paper stamped outside with the censor's mark. Incidentally, the direct result of her conversation with Mr. Faraday. "Dear Raymond," she murmured, "I was so happy about him out in Egypt, and now it seems there's a big change around. All very secret, of course, and he can't say anything, just that there really is a marvelous plan, and that I'm to be ready for some big surprise soon. I'm glad to know where he's being sent, but I really don't see why." Bletchley grunted. "Surely he's not allowed to tell you that." Tuppence gave a deprecating laugh and looked round the breakfast table as she folded up her precious letter. "Oh, we have our methods," she said. "Dear Raymond knows that if only I know where he is or where he's going, I don't worry quite so much. It's quite a simple way, too, just a certain word, you know, and after it the initial letters of the next word spell out the place. Of course, it makes rather a funny sentence sometimes, but Raymond is really most ingenious. I'm sure nobody would notice." Little murmurs arose round the table. The moment was well chosen. Everybody happened to be at the breakfast table together for once. Bletchley, his face rather red, said, "You'll excuse me, Mrs. Blenkinsop, but that's a damned foolish thing to do. Movements of troops and air squadrons are just what the Germans want to know." "Oh, but I can never tell anyone," cried Tuppence. "I'm very, very careful." "All the same, it's an unwise thing to do, and your boy will get into trouble over it some day." "Oh, I do hope not. I'm his mother, you see. A mother ought to know." "Indeed, and I think you're right," boomed out Mrs. O'Rourke. "Wild horses wouldn't drag the information from you. We know that." "Letters can be read," said Bletchley. "I'm very careful never to leave letters lying about," said Tuppence with an air of outraged dignity. "I always keep them locked up." Bletchley shook his head doubtfully. Part 3. It was a grey morning with the wind blowing coldly from the sea. Tuppence was alone at the far end of the beach. She took from her bag 2 letters that she had just called for at a small news agent's in town. They had taken some time in coming, since they had been readdressed there the second time to a Mrs. Spender. Tuppence liked crossing her tracks. Her children believed her to be in Cornwall with an old aunt. She opened the first letter. "Dearest Mother, lots of funny things I could tell you, only I mustn't. We're putting up a good show, I think. 5 German planes before breakfast is today's market quotation. Bit of a mess at the moment and all that, but we'll get there all right in the end. It's the way they machine gun the poor civilian devils on the roads that get me. It makes us all see red. Gus and Trundles want to be remembered to you. They're still going strong. Don't worry about me. I'm all right. Wouldn't have missed this show for the world. Loved old Carrot Top. Have the W.O. given him a job yet? Yours ever, Derek." Tuppence's eyes were very bright and shining as she read and reread this, and then she opened the other letter. "Dearest Mum, how's old Aunt Gracie? Going strong? I think you're wonderful to stick it. I couldn't. No news. My job is very interesting, but so hush hush I can't tell you about it. But I really do feel I'm doing something worthwhile. Don't fret about not getting any war work to do. It's so silly, all these elderly women rushing about wanting to do things. They only really want people who are young and efficient. I wonder how Carrots is getting on at his job up in Scotland, just filling up forms, I suppose. Still, he'll be happy to feel he's doing something. Lots of love, Deborah. Tuppence smiled. She folded the letters, smoothed them lovingly, and then under the shelter of a breakwater she struck a match and set them on fire. She waited until they were reduced to ashes. Taking out her fountain pen and a small writing pad, she wrote rapidly. Dearest Deb, it seems so remote from the war here that I can hardly believe there is a war going on. Very glad to get your letter and know that your work is interesting. Aunt Gracie has grown much more feeble and very hazy in her mind. I think she's glad to have me here. She talks a good deal about the old days and sometimes, I think, confuses me with my own mother. They are growing more vegetables than usual, have turned the rose garden into potatoes. I help old Sykes a bit. It makes me feel I'm doing something in the war. Your father seems a bit disgruntled, but I think, as you say, he too is glad to be doing something. Love from your Tuppeny mother. She took a fresh sheet. Darling Derek, a great comfort to get your letter. Send field postcards often if you haven't time to write. I've come down to be with Aunt Gracie a bit. She's very feeble. She will talk of you as though you were 7, and gave me 10 shillings yesterday to send you as a tip. I'm still on the shelf, and nobody wants my invaluable services. Extraordinary. Your father, as I told you, has got a job in the Ministry of Requirements. He's up north somewhere, better than nothing, but not what he wanted, poor old Carrot Top. Still, I suppose we've got to be humble and take a back seat and leave the war to you young idiots. I won't say take care of yourself, because I gather that the whole point is that you should do just the opposite, but don't go and be stupid. Lots of love, Tuppence. She put the letters into envelopes, addressed and stamped them, and posted them on her way back to Sans Souci. As she reached the bottom of the cliff, her attention was caught by 2 figures standing talking a little way up. Tuppence stopped dead. It was the same woman she had seen yesterday, and talking to her was Carl Van Deenum. Von Deenum. Regretfully, Tuppence noted the fact that there was no cover. She could not get near them unseen and overhear what was being said. Moreover, at that moment, the young German turned his head and saw her. Rather abruptly, the 2 figures parted. The woman came rapidly down the hill, crossing the road and passing Tuppence on the other side. Carl Von Deenum waited until Tuppence came up to him. Then gravely and politely he wished her good morning. Tuppence said immediately, "What a very odd-looking woman that was to whom you were talking, Mr. Deenum." "Yes, it's a Central European type. She is a Pole." "Really? A friend of yours?" Tuppence's tone was a very good copy of the inquisitive voice of Aunt Gracie in her younger days. "Not at all," said Carl stiffly. "I never saw the woman before." "Oh, really? I thought—" Tuppence paused artistically. "She asked me only for a direction. I speak German to her because she does not understand much English." "I see, and she was asking the way somewhere." "She asked me if I knew a Mrs. Gottlieb near here. I do not, and she says she has, perhaps got the name of the house wrong." "I see," said Tuppence thoughtfully. "Mr. Rosenstein, Mrs. Gottlieb." She stole a swift glance at Carl Von Deenum. He was walking beside her with a set, stiff face. Tuppence felt a definite suspicion of this strange woman, and she felt almost convinced that when she first caught sight of them, the woman and Carl had been already talking some time together. Carl Von Deenum. Carl and Sheila that morning. You must be careful. Tuppence thought, I hope these young things aren't in it. Soft, she told herself, middle-aged and soft, that's what she was. The Nazi creed was a youth creed. Nazi agents would in all probability be young, Carl and Sheila. Tommy said Sheila wasn't in it, yes, but Tommy was a man and Sheila was beautiful with a queer, breathtaking beauty. Carl and Sheila, and behind them that enigmatic figure, Mrs. Perrina. Mrs. Perrina, sometimes the voluble, commonplace guest house hostess, sometimes, for fleeting minutes, a tragic, violent personality. Tuppence went slowly upstairs to her bedroom. That evening, when she went to bed, she pulled out the long drawer of her bureau. At one side of it was a small, japanned box. I don't know if I said that right, but that's what it looks like. With a flimsy, cheap lock. Tuppence slipped on gloves, unlocked the box, and opened it. A pile of letters lay inside. On the top was the one received that morning from Raymond. Tuppence unfolded it with due precautions. Then her lips set grimly. There had been an eyelash in the fold of the paper this morning. The eyelash was not there now. She went to the washstand. There was a little bottle labeled innocently gray powder with a dose. Adroitly, Tuppence dusted a little of the powder onto the letter and onto the surface of the glossy japanned enamel of the box. There were no fingerprints on either of them. Again, Tuppence nodded her head with a certain grim satisfaction, for there should have been fingerprints, her own. A servant might have read the letters out of curiosity, though it seemed unlikely, certainly unlikely that she should have gone to the trouble of finding a key to fit the box. But a servant would not think of wiping off fingerprints. Mrs. Perrina? Sheila? Somebody else? Somebody at least who was interested in the movements of British armed forces. And Part 4. Tuppence's plan of campaign had been simple in its outlines. First, a general sizing up of probabilities and possibilities. Second, an experiment to determine whether there was or was not an inmate of Sanssouci who was interested in troop movements and anxious to conceal the third. Third, who that person was. It was concerning that third operation that Tuppence pondered as she lay in bed the following morning. Her train of thought was slightly hampered by Betty Sprott, who had pranced in at an early hour, preceding indeed the cup of somewhat tepid, inky liquid known as morning tea. Betty was both active and voluble. She had taken a great fancy to Tuppence. She climbed up on bed and thrust an extremely tattered picture book under Tuppence's nose, commanding with brevity, "Weed!" Tuppence read obediently, "Goosey, goosey gander, whither will you wander? Upstairs, downstairs, in my lady's chamber." Betty rolled with mirth, repeating in ecstasy, "Upstairs, upstairs, upstairs," and then with a sudden climax, "Down," and proceeded to roll off the bed with a thump. This proceeding was repeated several times. Oops. Where'd it go? Oh, here we are. Several times until it palled. Then Betty crawled about the floor, playing with Tuppence's shoes and muttering busily to herself in her own particular idiom, "Agdu ba pizza," just baby talk. Released to fly back to its own perplexities, Tuppence's mind forgot the child. The words of the nursery rhyme seemed to mock at her. "Goosey, goosey gander, whither shall ye wander?" Whither indeed. Goosey, that was her. Gander was Tommy. It was, at any rate, what they appeared to be, Tuppence had the heartiest contempt for Mrs. Blenkinsop. Mr. Meadows, the thought, was a little better. Stolid, British, unimaginative, quite incredibly stupid, both of them, she hoped. Fitting nicely into the background of Sansucci, both such possible people to be there. All the same, one must not relax. A slip was so easy. She had made one the other day, noting that mattered, but nothing that mattered, but just a sufficient indication to warn her to be careful. Such an easy approach to intimacy and good relations, an indifferent knitter asking for guidance. But she had forgotten that one evening her fingers had slipped into their own practiced efficiency, the needles clicking busily with the even note of the experienced knitter. Mrs. O'Rourke had noticed it. Since then she had carefully struck a medium course, not so clumsy as she had been at first, but not so rapid as she could be. "Agbu bait?" demanded Betty. She reiterated the question. "Agbu bait?" "Lovely, darling," said Tuppence absently. "Beautiful." Satisfied, Betty relapsed into murmurs again. Her next step, Tuppence thought, could be managed easily enough. That is to say, with the connivance of Tommy, she saw exactly how to do it. Lying there planning, time slipped by. Mrs. Sprott came in breathless to seek for Betty. "Oh, here she is. I couldn't think where she'd got to. Oh, Betty, you naughty girl. Oh, dear, Mrs. Blenkinsop, I am so sorry." Tuppence sat up in bed. Betty, with an angelic face, was contemplating her handiwork. She had removed all the laces from Tuppence's shoes and had immersed them in a tooth glass of water. She was prodding them now with a gleeful finger. Tuppence laughed and cut short Mrs. Sprott's apologies. "How frightfully funny. Don't worry, Mrs. Sprott. They'll recover all right. It's my fault. I should have noticed what she was doing. She was rather quiet." "I know," Mrs. Sprott sighed. "Whenever they're quiet, it's a bad sign. I'll get you some more laces this morning, Mrs. Blenkinsop." "Don't bother," said Tuppence. "They'll dry none the worse." Mrs. Sprott bore Betty away, and Tuppence got up to put her plan into execution. And that's all of Chapter 5. So it was Chapter 5. So next time, 6. Raining, raining, raining here. I'm so tired of rain. Hope we'll see the sun tomorrow. I'm going to check the weather app. Love y'all. Mwah. I say be sweet, don't be ugly. Bye.